Hello, and welcome to my talk about seeing self and no self through the archetype of the wise child. My name is Gala Wilkie, and I have an MA in Child Studies from Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. I'm also an artist, a figurative painter working mostly with oils. My arts training began in early childhood, taking lessons from the artist next door, and through my 20s as I took my numerous courses in drawing and painting at the Visual Arts Center in Montreal. In the book, Method Meets Art, Levy invites us to reflect on the question, what do the arts bring to the research? I found painting made room for my intuition to be expressed at several points during the image crafting process. Also, the time spent doing the art was spent in a reflective and observant state of awareness. Art allowed me to recall my subjective experience and connect to a sense of the self that I used to be. Because the art is then re-experienced by the viewer, the image remains open to multiple interpretations. For example, in the painting Selfie, I responded to the interplay of a sense of a personal self and a more public identity by painting a selfie photograph I had taken in a mirror. I found the act of painting helped me observe the photo more closely and gave me time to notice symbols. The painting includes two images placed back to back, one of my face and eye and another of my bare back. The image of my back seems anonymous and vulnerable, while the image of my face is more personal and expressive. I began to think about how symbols of the personal or subjective, as well as being markers of one's public identity, become embedded within a self-portrait. The present project was guided by the question, how did I come to be here and now, which arose out of my complex grief for an extended family member who passed away during the COVID pandemic. I felt that my connections to Washington, D.C., my grandparents' home, were disappearing. I wanted to understand how come my family was spread across 3 countries in 3 generations. I made the decision to paint scenes drawn from my family photos during the early childhood period to find out how I came to be separated from my Franco-American family and how I was alienated from my French heritage, though I lived primarily in a French-speaking town in Quebec. The aims of the project were to engage in autoethnography using family photographs and my painted images to generate a dialogue between myself and my mother. Painting allowed me to enter the flow state where symbolic associations and insights can arise. And dialogue with my mother allowed me to step outside of my first-person, childlike perspective and develop a mature perspective of the adult decisions that were made in that time. Because the project grew from my ongoing art practice, I approached it intuitively, documenting decisions rather than planning them in advance. The painting process was deeply therapeutic. Today, my goal is to share and discuss the 2 major symbols that emerged for me during my time in the studio, that of the happy or wise child and that of the element of water. If there is time, I would love to explore future possibilities for the self-portrait method. This is the self-portrait of my 8-month-old self entitled Happy Little Thing, and it is the final portrait I painted, but the first image in the chronological story of my childhood self. I placed it here as an example to discuss the methodology I will explain now. So what can a portrait image tell us about the self? First, there is the point of view to consider. In this image, the photograph was taken in a photographer's studio at the insistence of my grandmother in 1973. My mother and grandmother must have been in the room, but they do not appear in the image. The photographer captured a moment of joyful laughter, and I, as an artist, tried to capture the same expression in my painting. The importance of the laughing baby's expression was confirmed through dialogue with my mother, as she treasured this photograph because of the expression of my true nature and joy. Then there's the subjective experience of the subject to consider. I do not remember the moment, but the facial expression is typical for me even today. It is clear in the image that I was open and unafraid. Babies who are securely attached to their caregivers are mostly unafraid of others and expect to be well cared for. I believe this is clearly seen in the photo and in the painting. Through the face and the posture of the baby image, they convey these truths about the actual baby. Seated and relaxed, well-fed and joyful, secure and happy. The painting completely focuses on the baby and nothing else, showing her importance to the artist. She is the image of an ideal or pure self, a happy little thing. The full meaning of the pure, wise, happy child as a symbol unfolded gradually as my mother and I discussed the photographs and the paintings I created based on those photos. I found that the narratives in forms of poetry and discussions provided the necessary context to understand what the images were representing. Keeping all of this in mind, I'll now tell you the story found in my autoethnographic images as it unfolded for me as an artist and researcher. I presented these two paintings at the Canadian Association for the Study of Education's yearly conference in 2018. In that presentation, I spoke about the symbol of my grandmother as a mermaid. Since then, the related symbol of the ocean or water has continued to develop in my artwork. My use of the water or ocean to symbolize distances began as I learned about my grandmother's emigration from France to America. My grandmother's marriage dowry allowed her and her husband, my grandfather, to own and run a beauty shop in the small town of Jargeau in France, which is near Orléans. When their two girls were 3 and 5 years old, my grandparents immigrated to America, and after a year, they returned for their daughters, who then also immigrated, everyone settling in Washington, D.C. The time and distance of the separation between Anne-Marie and her daughters was never quite overcome, even once reunited. I realized this when my mother and I discussed the painting over text messages, which I edited to compose the poem above. And the two little fish in the painting symbolize her daughters. Images of fish help define the space between them as water and not air. Water becomes a symbol for space that is filled with something, in this case filled with physical and emotional distance. Here is a pencil sketch of a moment in time representing an idealized childhood and of myself as a happy child playing with water. Watering the flower children represents my cousin and myself being sprayed with garden hose in 1974 at my grandparents' home in Washington, D.C. My mother is seated and holding out the hose. Her elongated arms and legs show her reach, and the water sprays over my flower child head. I subjectively remember the joyful feeling of fun in being watered like a little flower and my fascination with the sparkling bright water. At that time, my sense of self was embedded in the feeling I was having, joy. Recalling this joyful feeling as a grieving adult led me to wonder where this true self, the joyful child, had gone. I clearly intuited I am the same person now as I was back then. I realized the images I was working with were all taken during reunions with my grandparents, when my mother would also be very happy to be back in her hometown with her family. The artwork couldn't help but bring positive memories as they were referenced from positive photos. A pivotal situation was my grandparents' divorce in 1974. This was a turbulent time, as both my mother and aunt had returned home with their same-aged toddlers. However, their family home was being sold and was no longer a place for them to stay. In the painting, Girls in the Zoo, I added the elephant and the lioness to the image to represent strength in mothering. Both animals raised their young independent of their male counterparts in groups of female relatives. This is the kind of support we briefly felt at the house in Washington, D.C. before the divorce was finalized. My mother's strength is also seen in her posture, holding both toddlers on her hips with a look of determination in her face. This determination came as she realized she would have to return to Montreal because of the change in family structure. Discussing with my mother the timeline of the events that followed these last two images, I finally understood why my mother and I always returned to Montreal, even though we seemed happiest when we were together with our Franco-American family. Finally, in the painting Little Devi, the symbols of water or ocean and the symbol of the happy child come together. I painted another photograph depicting myself at play in my grandparents' house in Washington. I remember this moment well, and the feelings of lightheartedness and playfulness I associated with playing with the vinyl beach chair. In my memories, I had merged the house in Washington with my grandmother's later house in Florida. This is represented by the ocean waves in the background. In my painterly eye, I saw the similarity between the vinyl beach chair and the waves of the sea. I was symbolically engaged in the emotional ocean of my family's changing structure, also actually entangled in the chair. The poem accompanying this painting came to me while painting and through the many conversations with my mother about the painting. Quote, "The wise child knows things, sees what's going on," end quote, refers to this symbolic image of potential happiness that my child self embodied for the adults around me, in particular my mother and my grandparents. I titled the painting Little Devi because I found myself adding Buddhist symbols to the painting. In Robert Beer's book, Buddhist Symbols, I learned that the lotus bud is symbolic of enlightenment, and the conch shell is symbolic of the clear sound or truth of the Dharma. The symbols work well with the image of the happy child, who also seems to embody potential and hope for the future. So my toddler identity represented something to my grandparents and mother that I was unaware of at the time. I was known throughout childhood as a happy baby and a wise child. My toddler self embodied joy and symbolized the hopeful return of good feelings when emotions were actually very difficult. But subjectively, I was simply myself. It was only in gradually reflecting that I began to understand my joyful moment then was symbolic of hope. How odd to realize my subjective feeling came to identify me, which then became symbolic for my family members. As I grew up, I felt the pressure to be a beacon of hope, a little Devi, which I have represented in this painting. With this insight, I am reorganizing my current sense of self and identity. This is self-healing through self-knowledge. The ocean, as a symbol of emotion, is useful because it can be thought of as ever-changing, like the experience of the self can be, or as full of an emotion that is difficult to articulate, such as distance. Many Buddhist scholars use water metaphors for the experience of mind. In particular, the Dalai Lama himself refers to the self as an endless stream of consciousness. In this autoethnography, the symbol of the ocean has stood for distance and separation, as well as for the family connections and joy. From a Buddhist perspective, emotions like joy and distance are part of the self, just like consciousness is part of the self. But it is argued there is no self that remains once these parts fall apart. It is interesting that I re-experienced as an adult the subjective emotions that made me feel like me when I was a child. The painting process itself was fluid and positive. Research aims grew as the project grew, intuitively, step by step. And so what did the art contribute to the research? In painting, I found a creative visual space to bring subjective memories and knowledge of symbols together. I was then able to reflect and discuss my findings and refine my understanding of my formative years. With this self-knowledge, I was able to deepen my personal connections and recover from complex grief. I will now welcome any questions and discussion points that you may have. Thank you for your listening.